Hello there, Fravaka here, and thanks for checking out my lesson on landing jet airplanes in DCS. This is a basic lesson intended to lay the foundation for real pilot skills. Not everything I say is completely technically accurate nor all-encompassing, just simplified points to make it easier to understand, quick and basic. For the scope of this lesson, I will skip anything about the traffic pattern, communications, or airplane-specific procedures, and just focus on how to get a jet down on the runway in a condition where it can be used again, which is preferred because there's less paperwork that way. Alright, I'll get to the point and tell you how to make good landings right now. The key is a stabilized approach. Now, I define a stabilized approach as being in the landing configuration, trimmed on your approach speed, on about a 3-degree glide path, and here's the big key, being able to maintain that with minimal adjustments to attitude and power. Meaning that you can't make large and abrupt control inputs as you try to hold on to it. Instead, you want small and smooth adjustments to maintain that approach all the way down to the runway. This is arguably the most important part of a good landing. So, why is the approach that important? Because if every single landing you can arrive over the runway at the same height and the same speed while stabilized, then the landing flare and the touchdown takes the same motion each time. So every landing starts to look and feel the same, becoming a muscle memory action and making it way easier to refine. But let's come back to the flare later. For now, let's talk about that approach. You want to fly the airplane down to the runway touchdown zone. Now this technically should be the 1,000-foot markers. Those are the two big fat white bars. But not all runways have them, like many of the ones in the Caucasus. So in that case, just aim somewhere above the numbers or just below the black marks. We're not looking for precision yet. The goal is to fly the airplane so its flight path, the spot that the plane is heading towards, leads right to your touchdown zone. In planes with modern heads-up displays, the velocity vector shows us our flight path, and all we really need to do is line it up with the touchdown zone all the way down final approach. If your plane doesn't have a heads-up display, then you're just going to have to visualize where you're heading and make your best judgment about your flight path. Controlling the flight path and steering it over the touchdown zone should always be done with minimal adjustments to attitude and power. And in order to do that, you must absolutely be trimmed. Stable airplanes, when trimmed to a certain airspeed, will have a natural tendency to return to that speed, making your job a whole lot easier. So use trim. As to how to fly the plane during an approach, well, explaining that is really a whole lesson all on its own about slow flight. For the sake of this lesson, I'll do the quick version. As you slow an airplane down from cruise speeds, there comes a point where drag actually increases as you get slower. When a plane is in this slow region of flight, like during an approach, we see a greater relationship between power and altitude, and a greater relationship between pitch and airspeed. This is the opposite of what we see in typical flight, and this means how we have to respond to the need for change must be different when flying slow. That being said, flying airplanes is still a matter of attitude plus power equals performance. Both aspects always work together. So an example. If you were fast, you'd want to pitch up a little bit, and then trim it so that the nose stays there, and also reduce just a touch of power. With the initial pitch up, you will see the speed reduction you want start almost immediately. But if there's no power reduction to go with it, you will soon see a reduced rate of descent, or possibly even a climb. This would mean that you'd end up higher than you wanted to be, and now you have a whole new problem to fix. That can lead to a cycle of chasing corrections. Another example. If you were high, or maybe needed to increase the rate of descent, you reduce the power and just bump the nose down, but don't hold the stick input. Remember that when you're trimmed to a speed, the plane will want to return to that speed naturally. So you only need to help it with a nudge in the right direction, but don't need to hold it or trim it in this case. If you don't guide it, the nose would drop on its own from the power reduction. It would do it with just a bit of lag, but it'll also overdo it and start an up and down oscillation. Not ideal. So in short, when you're fast, you want to pitch up a little, trim it, and reduce the power. When you're slow, you want to pitch the nose down, trim it, and increase power. If you are high or you needed to increase the rate of descent, reduce the power and bump the nose down. Don't hold it. If you're slow, you want to increase the power and raise the nose up just a little. This is key to how you control an airplane while on approach, so remember it well. Alright, big giant asterisk here for airplanes that have flight control systems, or FCS, like the Hornet and the Viper. So in these planes, it's trim for airspeed, power for altitude, exclusively. See, the FCS computer is really flying the plane for you based on your inputs, and it makes several adjustments all on its own. So once you have the plane trimmed on approach speed, you do not make pitch inputs anymore, or you'll be fighting the FCS. So at that point, you're really only using the stick for roll corrections, and then you use the power alone to control your rate of descent. It's a bit of a different feel from normal airplanes, but it works really well when you get used to it. Also know that with all jets, the turbine's response to power changes is not instant. You always want to be a little ahead of the need for power changes. Never hesitate. You won't hurt these turbine engines by moving the throttle back and forth a whole bunch. So always be making lots of little corrections during the whole approach in order to stay ahead of the plane's needs. That throttle hand should almost always be moving just a little. Alright, so what is the right approach speed for your airplane? Well, in jets, angle of attack, or also known as alpha, is used to determine what the right speed for an approach is. The angle of attack is just the angle between the relative wind and the wing. And since weight can vary greatly from landing to landing in these jets, this is a far better choice for determining approach speed than using a set airspeed. However, if during a single approach you find your on-speed angle of attack, you could then look at what airspeed gives you that on-speed, and then fly that airspeed as reference during that approach, if you prefer. To show you what angle of attack you need for the approach, most jets have an AOA indexer like this to indicate if you're too slow, too fast, or on speed. Other planes may just have an alpha indication on their HUD, where you just fly the recommended number. The Harrier, for example, is usually 10 to 12 units of alpha for approach. Some planes, like the Tomcat here, have an AOA indicator with a mark on it for approach speeds. Some planes also have the E bracket shown on their HUD as well to indicate approach speed. You simply pitch the velocity vector so it aligns with the center of the bracket and trim it so it stays there all on its own. However it's displayed, your goal is to slow the plane to the correct angle of attack, trim to maintain that on speed, and then use minor pitch and trim to maintain it for the entire approach. This is very key to a stabilized approach. If you're having trouble with it, then you probably should do some slow flight practice up at altitude. So here's an initial practice approach scenario. Set yourself up with your plane about 10 miles from a runway, lined up with it, doing maybe 200 knots at about 2,500 feet above field elevation. For now, just use runways near the sea for simplicity's sake, since the field elevation will be pretty close to sea level. Straight off, you'll want to drop the gear and the landing flaps, and try to maintain relatively level while you get slowed down to your on-speed angle of attack. To do that, as the plane slows, you will need to pull the stick back enough to keep that velocity vector at the level line, or a vertical speed of 0. And as the speed continues to decrease, this takes more and more nose-up attitude, so you'll want to add in trim to make it easier to keep. As you get near the right angle of attack, you'll bring in the power enough to keep you from sinking as you refine your pitch and trim to maintain on speed while using power to prevent any climbing or sinking. Hopefully you end up in level flight, on speed, and trimmed so that you can take your hands off the controls for just a moment and still be stable. At that point, you're ready to start a steady descent towards the runway by reducing power enough to get the velocity vector over the touchdown zone. An ideal rate of descent is about 700 to 800 feet per minute or so. That should get you on about a 3-degree glide path, indicated by the vector being about 3 degrees below the level line. You don't have to be exact, but the closer the better. So, if the vector is over the touchdown zone and 3 degrees below level, then you're on glide path. If, however, the vector was in the touchdown zone, but lower than 3 degrees, and your rate of descent over 800 feet per minute, then that would mean you're too high. So adjust like I said before for being high. You reduce power, bump the nose down and maintain speed, let that vector fall below the runway, and keep it there for a little while before you reverse all that, bringing the power and the nose up, returning the vector back to the touchdown zone. Repeat that as needed until you find that sweet 3-degree glide slope. Do the reverse if you're too low, bringing the power and the nose up just a bit to bring the vector above the runway, always maintaining speed, and hold it there as long as you need to get on glide path, then adjust to bring the vector back to your touchdown zone. If you are not lined up with the runway center line, just use a very small amount of bank to turn so that the vector is on the far side of the runway. So move the vector to the right of the runway if you are left of lineup. When you look like you're centered with the runway or about to be centered, small bank again to bring the vector back to the center line of the runway. Now, the whole point of this very long straight-in approach is just to give you practice stabilizing the approach and mostly seeing what the correct descent angle looks like, what the runway looks like when you're on the correct descent angle. So repeat the exercise as needed until you recognize what that on-glide path approach looks like with your approximate 700 foot per minute rate of descent. As you bring the plane as stable as possible down to that approximately 100 foot above the runway, or when you think you're maybe 1 or 2 seconds from hitting the runway. Doesn't have to be precise. That's the time for the landing flare. You gently and smoothly pull the stick back, while at the same time very slowly bringing the power to idle. The stick pull you want to be enough to slow your rate of descent, but never enough to start climbing again. This is very important. You want the velocity vector to come up very, very close to the level line just prior to touchdown, but never, ever above it. At the same time, also be slowly and smoothly bringing the throttle all the way to the idle stop. Should take you maybe 2 or 3 seconds. The exact timing of the idle getting to 0 is not all that important. Slow and smooth is. So just let your hand do that part with very little conscious effort. Instead, be very focused out front at your sight picture and the vector and smoothly pulling the stick back. The exact right amount of pull and the feel of it will come with practice. But honestly, as long as you give yourself that stabilized approach to start off with, any flare that slows the rate of descent some is still enough to land safely. Beyond that, there is plenty of room for improvement and for finesse. Trying to make that landing where the rate of descent kisses 0 at the exact moment of touchdown, that's the dream. But a safe landing will always be good enough. One last note. Navy airplanes are designed to not be flared. In order to land on a carrier and trap a wire, the plane can't be flared. And so the landing gear is designed to just be slammed on the deck. So if you're flying something like the F-14 or the 18, you can feel free to not flare and continue the approach all the way down and only reduce power to idle in that last 100 feet prior to touchdown. Just make sure you're on speed and the rate of descent is about 700 feet per minute. You could flare these planes, but you would then have to unlearn that whenever you try to land at the boat. Alright, so practice that long straight-in approach until you get the feel for what a 3-degree glide path looks like and can fly a stabilized approach. Once you get that, you can start your approaches from closer and lower until you feel more comfortable. Practice your landing flare on every approach that you get stabilized. But if you're still not fairly stable below 200 feet, just go around. Don't try to save the landing, because that's just teaching yourself bad habits. And when you're first learning all this, try to be patient and remember to stay relaxed on the controls. It won't come right away. After all, landing is one of the hardest things to master in aviation. And I promise you, every pilot, even professional ones, are always critical of their own landings. even after they have done hundreds of them, so try to go easy on yourself. As long as the plane still works after your landing, then you did good. Now if the plane doesn't work and you can walk away, then that means you only did okay. Well, that's all for this lesson. If you have any questions or requests for me, please leave them in the comments. I do check them. I also give one-on-one instruction by request. I've done single topics or whole programs before. If you're interested or you want to know more, just reach out to me on Discord. My tag's in the description. Also, you can watch me over on Twitch. I stream instructional lessons and missions whenever I can. Thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe out there.